Thank you everyone for sitting with us in silence. And this is just a reminder, if there's anything in your hands that you can do right now to fight against the injustices that are going and happening around the world, please do them. Even if you think it won't make a difference, even if you think it's not as important. I think all of us tend to say that. And if we gather together as communities and we stand up to the injustices, we can at least maintain our own humanity. And I think that that's one of the most important things for us to do right now. Over to you, Alexis.
Thanks so much, Luigi, and thanks for leading us in that moment of silence. It's really important to take the time to internalize and reflect what's happening in the world. So thanks for that, Luigi. Could we flick to the next slide, please? Amazing. So today we have 4 brilliant speakers with us, and we don't want to take up too much time because we want to make sure we have all the time to hear their insights, but we have 4 key learning outcomes for today. The first is to be able to articulate the connections between geopolitics, climate change, and security. The second is to understand the impacts of geopolitics of international climate change policy in multiple different geographic and political contexts. The third is to understand how climate change and geopolitics are related. And we have speakers from Ukraine, Palestine, and Sudan to speak to those specific geographic contexts. And the last is really just to is not listed here, is just to hold an hour and a half to listen to one another, to make sure that we're internalizing these things that we often see on the news and understand how they are affecting people, and preparing ourselves to stand in solidarity. So with that, we'll go to the next slide just to go through our running order briefly. So we'll start with remarks from Dr. Dhanashree Jariam. Then we've got my brilliant colleague, Dr. Evgenia Kopitsia, who will be speaking to us about the context in Ukraine. Hassan Hamed, speaking from the Palestinian context, and finishing last but not least with Nisreen El-Saim, who's a Sudanese climate activist. So we're delighted to have them all here today. And without further ado, I'll pass over to Luigi to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Alexis. So for our first speaker, we have Dr. Dhanashree Jariam, and she's going to give us an intro to the global context. Dr. Dhanashree is an assistant professor in the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations and a co-coordinator for the Center of Climate Studies, Manipal Academy of Higher Education, Karnataka, India. She holds a PhD in Geopolitics and International Relations from MAHE. Her primary fields of interest include climate politics and diplomacy, environmental security and military, regional environmental policy in Asia, and environmental peace building. She is the author of Breaking Out of the Greenhouse, Indian Leadership in the Times of Environmental Change, and Climate Diplomacy and Emerging Economies, India as a Case Study, which was published in 2021. Thank you so much, Dr. Dhanashree, for joining us, and it was lovely to have you here. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alexis, Luigi, for the kind introduction, and also for having me as part of this program, which sounds fantastic, bringing together so many different voices and also so many people interested in climate justice and climate action across the world. Because of a technical issue, I'm just going to keep my video off while I share my presentation, if that's okay. But I will share my presentation, and as Alexis mentioned at the beginning, what I will be talking about mostly is connecting climate change with geopolitics, because I think what is important to understand here is that, just a second, is that, very often we tend to talk about climate change, disconnecting it from geopolitics, and the conflicts and the many things that are going on around the world. We sometimes tend to talk about it in global terms because, of course, there's climate change negotiations happening at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. There are also localized issues, which are probably most important to the most vulnerable communities. And I think geopolitics is present in both. And what I'm going to present mostly is the macro level geopolitics, because we know what is going on today and what Luigi also mentioned at the beginning of the session, the kind of injustices that we are seeing across the world. So how do we connect climate change with these issues? So usually I start by looking at, what are the global risks and how do we rank global risks? And this is something that is often spoken about in terms of, the World Economic Forum comes out with these risk report every year. And we often see that in the long-term risks, or 4 out of 5, and sometimes even 5 out of 5 risks are usually related to climate change or related to environmental degradation, of course, critical change to Earth systems, etc. And what does this really tell us is that in the long term, we are looking at a lot of risks which are going to compound and cascade into much bigger problems. And we are already seeing polycrisis and multiple crises around us. And these are all intersecting with each other, which is why I put this figure here, infographic, which shows how systemic risk is something that has become a part of how climate change is also affecting so many different things at different levels, whether it is technology, or how technology is being viewed, or how technology is developing, how critical manufacturing sector is also evolving along with that, how communication sector is evolving. So all these different sectors are equally affected by climate change, and climate action also affects the way we think about these issues. In terms of climate impacts, I don't think I really have to tell this audience, which is I'm sure, very attuned to listening about what are the various impacts of climate change. And usually I again look at it in terms of direct effects, indirect effects, and systemic impacts. Of course, direct impacts range from rising temperatures to, heat waves, to typhoons, to floods, cyclones, etc., to second order impacts, which is something that we go beyond and look at how it affects society, economy, especially vulnerable sectors like agriculture, fisheries, water, energy, food security. Very importantly, livelihoods, which is something very important to most countries, particularly in the global south, where climate change affects these, livelihood security, and in effect also has these ripple effects on human mobility, for instance. And then we come to third order impacts, where we see geopolitical impacts, impacts on financial systems, trade, markets, regulations, because we are looking at very wide ranging impacts, which is why we are, I'll come to some of these examples later on, where we're talking about how climate change could affect even statehood in the case of many small island developing states, where migration is one issue, but also inhabitability of these islands could also have long range impacts on islands. Another major way of looking at climate change, particularly through the geopolitical lens, is how environmental degradation, biodiversity loss has often been also connected with insecurity and conflict in many contexts. And because it has negative impacts on natural resources, livelihoods, and human security. And therefore, it also has cascading impacts on societal stability, and it especially in areas where there are pre-existing tensions and ethnic conflicts. Now, that's just to establish a context in which geopolitics and climate change are interlinked with each other. To give you a broad idea, I've just taken some examples here to understand how they intersect with each other, particularly when national interests are, intersecting with ecological interests, and ecological boundaries don't really, then they don't respect political boundaries, or political boundaries don't respect ecological boundaries, and which is why what we are seeing today, for instance, in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, where you have multiple countries, and you can see how much of interconnected ecosystems are we talking about, where you have so many river basins which are transboundary in nature. Yet what we see is that there is so less or little cooperation between countries on transboundary management of these waters. There are some of course, agreements existing, such as the Indus Waters Treaty between India and Pakistan, which has come under a lot of scrutiny in recent times, with India suspending the treaty. Or you have, like, some other treaties like the Bangladesh India Ganges sharing treaty. And of course, you have a lot of rivers that flow from the Tibetan Plateau, which is in China, to South Asia and Southeast Asia. And the dam construction that is going on across all these river basins has a lot of impact on the communities that depend on these river systems. What is important is also to understand that climate change is also affecting the water levels in these rivers, whether it is because of the effects on the glacial variability or otherwise. So this kind of shows how, where you already have geopolitically tense relationship, and where there is a lack of cooperation because of the existing geopolitical scenario, climate change sort of gets undermined, or climate cooperation does not get as much focus as much it requires, especially with the kind of changes, ecological damage and ecological changes that we are seeing today. The other aspect that I wanted to highlight here is the issue of climate change in the military. I'm sure that in the subsequent presentation, some of these issues will be dealt with in greater detail, but I just wanted to flag it that defense has a carbon problem. This is well-known factor that the military is one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases. And the military, even under the Paris Agreement, although military is not exempt from declaring their emissions, it's a voluntary act. And you may have seen in recent reports, what kind of emissions are coming from conflicts such as in Ukraine, in Palestine, in Gaza, and what kind of emissions are already happening with the conflicts. But also, if you see, there is so less accountability as far as the military's emissions are concerned. There are hardly any militaries that voluntarily declare their emissions to the rest of the world. Now, this in effect has a lot of, again, shows how geopolitics, climate, and pollution and all these different factors are interconnected with each other. At the same time, military is also projected as an actor that needs to start prioritizing climate change, because we see a lot of humanitarian disasters happening, especially the climate-induced disasters, wherein the militaries tend to play a big role in providing rescue and relief in majority of cases. And we also see, like, a lot of actors like NATO, for instance, has established a Center for Excellence on Climate Security, which kind of shows how climate security is institutionalized, maybe not in the right way, because obviously this does not really solve the root cause of the problem, which is really about the emissions, which the militaries have still not, do not really have a action plan as far as emissions reduction is concerned. From there, I'll move on to another area where you will again see, how these issues are interconnected, and this is energy transitions. Again, why is energy transition so important? Because this is seen as a solution for climate change, and we need to sort of do this on a very urgent basis. But where are the critical minerals going to come from for energy transitions? And this is where, again, geopolitics tends to play a big role. Some of it, you can see, particularly in recent times, the race for critical minerals has become so urgent. Of course, critical minerals are used in the defense sector as well, and many other sectors, critical infrastructure, and many other sectors that require critical minerals, which is why these are dual-use minerals, which is also required for your solar energy, wind energy, and many other types of clean energy sources that you want to harness for the energy transitions. And again, if you look at recent debates, like this whole debate on, the US and, President Trump saying Greenland is ours, and, looking at all the minerals that are there in Greenland, kind of shows why this is so much in focus. There are also, minerals in the oceans, for instance, and that is why we are also talking about deep sea mining and seabed mining as a major problem for biodiversity conservation and marine biodiversity. And therefore, the High Seas Treaty, for instance, is a major step in the right direction as far as tackling these problems is concerned. We are also seeing, similar debates about Ukraine, for instance, where, there are large deposits of minerals, which are, again, at the center of attention, particularly with the US, flagging it again and again. The other examples here also show, for instance, this is a lithium triangle in South America, where you have Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia. And this is, again, an area where a lot of countries from outside of this region are very keen on tapping into these resources, which are, again, especially for your transportation sector, electric vehicles require a large amount of lithium. Again, some of the examples show that much of these extractive industries are following the same patterns of extraction that have existed previously with other extractive industries. So in the sense, even if we are moving away from coal or trying to reduce our dependence on coal, if we are going to reinforce these power asymmetries that have existed for a long time, even in the extractive industries that are going to be so critical for our energy transitions, in effect, there is going to be large-scale climate injustice. It's the same with Afghanistan is another example that you may see here, which has large amount of copper deposits and also rare earth elements and lithium as well, which are a lot of them are untapped resources, of course, but you also see countries like China particularly interested in tapping into some of these resources. And we know the kind of situation which is ongoing in Afghanistan with the Taliban regime, and how much of this can complicate the geopolitical scenario in this country. Congo is another country that was mentioned earlier in the introduction, and I would like to again bring to your attention here how Congo, for instance, contributes more than 60% of the cobalt, which is again needed for your energy transitions. But if you look at how many people in Congo have access to like electricity, it's hardly around 20%. And that is a climate injustice, energy injustice that I'm talking about, that a country that is spurring energy transitions or has so much potential in terms of spurring energy transition across the world is reeling under environmental, ecological conflicts, human rights violations, labor violations, and so on. So this is, again, showing how geopolitics, because a lot of countries are interested in these minerals. It's not just, of course, these countries, whether they are benefiting from the minerals or not is a different question. As I said, in the case of Congo, for instance, there's not much benefit that the local population gets from these mining, but it's the external players who have a much bigger role. So in that sense, there is like a large scale tensions around how these extractive industries are already perpetuating the injustices that have existed. This is another example where I wanted to also highlight, because geopolitics is something that is being spoken about a lot in the context of the Pacific Island states, and you may see the exclusive economic zones that these islands possess, which is again of large scale interest to some of the external players. That includes, of course, of course, you can say neighboring Australia, of course, and then you have China, you have United States, and many others who you can see that these exclusive economic zones, again, have a lot of course, resources, and that includes minerals, that includes fisheries, and many other resources that are required for food security, maybe for energy security, etc. But what you also see that these issues are entangled in the geopolitical conversations, because much of what Australia is trying to do, just signing this landmark agreement with Tuvalu, for instance, it's called Landmark Climate Migration Pact. But the Migration Pact itself is contingent on Tuvalu, also restricting access to its country, restricting access to China. So it's also a security pact. So as much as a climate pact is being signed, you also see that the security pact is also part and parcel of what comes with it. This is where this is my last slide, and this is just to show, in terms of geopolitics, what we are seeing, for instance, like a couple of years ago, the Pacific Island Forum came up with a declaration on continuity of statehood and the protection of persons in the face of climate change related sea level rise. And this is an important declaration because many countries might lose statehood, because as of now, the kind of, the international laws that exist do not recognize climate change. That includes the UN, even the law of sea, for instance. So therefore, it is important to establish the fact that statehood needs to be protected. And also, we also see other cases where climate justice is being advanced, for instance, by the Pacific Island states, but also many others who came together to push for an advisory opinion on states' obligations in respect of climate change, which has been approved by the General Assembly, and the International Court of Justice will be having that mandate. So this shows that there are some positive elements which we need to also take forward, especially connecting, how geopolitics can also be a positive factor. But in terms of, advancing these conversations. These are my key messages. I've already mentioned them, so I don't want to say that again, but thank you so much for patient listening, and happy to take questions and comments later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dhanasri. That was incredibly informative and eye-opening. There's a lot about the certain areas and stuff that I didn't know about personally, and I'm sure that everyone else benefited as well. I'm passing over to Alexis now to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Jariam. That was so interesting and such a good way to start our discussion with these 3 subsequent case studies from our speakers. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Evgenia Kopitsia, a colleague of mine at the University of Oxford and a law scholar specializing in environmental, climate, and energy law from international, EU, and Ukrainian perspectives. Evgenia joined the law faculty of the University of Oxford in April 2023, and her research focuses on climate change and net zero legal dilemmas in the polycrises era. She also serves as an associate professor at the Yaroslav Mudry National Law University, where she leads the Sustainable Development and Environmental Law Research Center and coordinates the Europe-Ukraine Energy Transition Hub, which is an international consortium aiming to leverage the green reconstruction of Ukraine and provide support to strengthen Ukraine's governance, regulatory frameworks, and market mechanisms in the field of energy, sustainability, and climate action. So thank you so much for joining us, Evgenia. We're delighted to have you here, and over to you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And can you see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And thank you, Dhanasri, for giving such a comprehensive overview of the challenges that the whole world is facing these days. In my talk, I would like to zoom into the case study of the country I come from. But I would start first and foremost with the open question, whether net zero can ensure peace. That's why the title of my today's presentation is Beyond the Crisis. And for this, I would welcome you all, dear participants, to have a look at the following 2 pics and to brainstorm. Just pause for a second, look at the screens and brainstorm what can be in common between these 2. On the right side, you would see the ongoing Russian war against Ukraine that started in 2014. And on the left side, wildfires in California that happened in 2024. So if you can share your ideas, what is in common between these 2? Feel free to do it in the chat. Oh, thanks. I even opened the chat and great. Carbon emissions, violence, instability, insecurity, loss and damage. That's very great ideas. catastrophes, fires, loss of the livelihood. Oh yes, we are both on fire. These are both on fire, that's for sure. Need for the humanitarian aid. Yeah, that's absolutely true. This threat to the human's existence. Brilliant. Carbon emissions. Yeah, thanks. And we could hear it from the previous presentation. Environmental degradation. Oh, I very much like the point of capitalism. This is what I very much like when speaking about this instability and climate insecurity, that there is this elephant in the room. Violation of the rule of law. Brilliant. Unplanned outcomes. Oh, that's a very great idea. Because when we have the unplanned outcomes, we should think about resilience and how we can tackle it both from the concept of the resilience framework. Environmental damage, irreversible. All right. War. Wow, this is really fantastic ideas. Monopoly of natural resources, great, thanks a lot. And geopolitical inaction, thanks. We have a very fantastic and very knowledgeable audience here. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate your brainstorming ideas. And if some other ideas come to your mind, please continue sharing. And you are all absolutely right that there is lots in common, that for a reason the humankind haven't been paying enough attention to. But there is one point, there is one more elephant in the room, and this is fossil fuels. This is the energy. And why fossil fuels? Because coal, oil, and gas extraction has a lasting legacy of violence and destruction. And we can see it in most of the conflicts and wars worldwide that has been happening in the 20s and the 21st century. We can see it in Sudanese civil war, in the killings of indigenous communities in Nigeria, to the modern conflicts in Mozambique. And of course, to the ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine. But this is a very interesting topic to bring from the scholarship perspective. Looking into the point that energy has always been the resource that enabled the humankind to prosper. But at the same time, energy has become the source of climate crisis, injustice, and inequalities. And if you have a look at this chart, which show the countries with the largest cumulative emissions, starting from the end of the 19th century till recently, that was produced by the fantastic outlet Carbon Brief, you can see on the top 3 countries that are responsible for the most of the cumulative emissions. These are United States, China, and Russia. When I have a look at this chart, every time my mind is saying, wait, there is something in there, right? And if to see the fossil fuels, not only the source of the climate crisis, but as well fossil fuels as a source of the ongoing wars and the source of the democratic backsliding. This graph illustrates the relationship between fossil fuel dependence and democratic institutions. And it's interesting to see that countries with higher reliance on fossil fuels tend to have lower democracy scores, which enables the argument that fossil fuel wealth can undermine democratic institutions. And I have pointed out at this chart the US democratic decline. And I'm sure that I don't need to explain why this Trump factor takes place. And when we have the Trump policies favoring fossil fuels expansion, we can obviously see the link between the ongoing concerns about democratic norms, polarization, and the rule of law. So, fossil fuels is not only the source of the climate change. Fossil fuels are the source of wars. And when the full Russian-scale invasion started in 2022, this was published in The Guardian. And the top Ukrainian climate scientist, Svetlana Krakowska, that back then in February, on the 22nd of February, was taking part in IPCC meeting, the Intergovernmental Panel on the Climate Change. She brought it up to the fora of the international community, saying, wait, this is not just the war, this is not just the aggression, this is the fossil fuel war. Interestingly enough, in 2021, the Finnish Institute of International Affairs has brought up in the academic publication the point that Western-driven transition away from the fossil fuel-based economy towards a renewable energy-based may deepen the Russian leadership's suspicions about global climate policy, which meant that the global rise in renewable energy source and the transition towards the decarbonized energy economy can make Russia a significant threat for its export revenues and thus for the Russian economic and therefore political security. And this was published in 2021. It had the 2022 to happen when this link started to be obvious for some, but not for everyone. The vicious cycle or the price of dependency can be exemplified with the following numbers. $7 trillion was spent globally on fossil fuel subsidies in 2022, while Russia continued to earn, fueled by these subsidies, around 800 billion euros in revenues from the fossil fuel exports since the onset of the full-scale war in Ukraine. This sum of money enabled the militarization, the weapon production, and the ongoing Russian aggression. But it's not all. For example, Belgium, the country that has been standing there up for Ukraine, allocated approximately 350 million euros for the humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, simultaneously invested billions in Russian liquefied natural gas. And overall, in 2023 alone, the European Union spent around 9 billion on Russian LNG, even as it facilitated LNG exports to China and India. But the numbers are even worse and even more striking. An average European citizen, the citizen of the European Union, has paid more than 500 euros for Russian fossil fuels since the invasion. And with the Russian fossil tracker that is taking the stock on every single cent, every single penny spent, and sent to Russia war machine. This is what has been happening since the introduction of sanctions against Russia. With this chart, you can see who bought Russian fossil fuels after EU ban. Of course, on the top is China, India, and Turkey, widely on the news. But again, European and G7 countries continue to do the same. And despite the outcry against Russian aggression, their policies remain pretty much in the contradiction. And publicly condemning Russia's actions, these nations continue to provide financial support through fossil fuels purchases. And if the European member states spend at least this much money on a mix of green solutions, while saying that it's impossible to transition away from the Russian fossil fuels if this sum of money were repurposed. This is what European Union could have had in response. More than 2,000 solar homes, 23,000 on football fields of solar PV, like more than 6,000 onshore wind turbines, much more heat pumps, much more insulated homes, much more offshore wind turbines. Instead, the Russian war against Ukraine has continued being funded by the fossil fuels money, continued to cause unprecedented damage, not only to Ukraine, but to Europe and the world as a whole. If we can see on this chart the levels of the poverty rate that's drastically increased in Ukraine, we could see the cascading effects of the full Russian-scale invasion on the global economy, something that truly undermined the food security all around the world. And when we're talking about the immense human losses of Ukrainians, it's only one piece of the puzzle of this big fossil fuel dependency and fossil fuel war. The reconstruction of Ukraine is believed to become one of the most difficult multilateral challenges of the 21st century, and the costs are currently estimated at around 500 billion euros, which is almost 3 times the estimated nominal GDP of Ukraine for 2024. But beyond the physical reconstruction, and again, Ukraine here serves as a case study, there is much more in people, in restoration of justice, in peace-building efforts. So reconstruction is far beyond the physical reconstruction. It should and must address the social, economic, and environmental renewal. Since we're here talking about environmental, climate, and geopolitics, we should also remember that it has been the nature that suffered the most. Nature is a silent victim of war. This was the citation that was pretty much in the news with regards to the ongoing war in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Gaza, and all over the world. With regards to Ukraine, environmental damage today carries a total cost of 200 billion US dollars and is about to rise. Over 20% of Ukraine's forests are burned by rockets. At least 10 years to restore, but decades and centuries to renew. Ukraine is currently assessed as the most mined country in the world since the Second World War. 30% of Ukraine's agricultural land was uncultivated in 2023 due to the explosive contaminations. And here you can see the pics from the satellites. And as has been already addressed by the previous presenter, war always contributes to the climate change. And as of December 2024, the greenhouse gas emissions linked to the warfare in Ukraine reached 175 million tons of CO2 equivalent, which equals the annual emissions of such a country like Belgium. And as it has been mentioned, the current UNFCCC framework, the current international climate regime, does not foresee the accountability measures for conflict-related emissions as well as for the military-related emissions as well. These are the reports that has been that was published in February 2024, calculating the overall of the greenhouse gas emissions connected to the ongoing war. But as well, the big part of the greenhouse gas emissions will be connected with the reconstruction, with the restoration and recovery. But as well, one more point that I would like to bring, that energy, while being the source of the climate crisis, energy being as the source of the climate injustice and wars, has also become the target. And since 2022, Russian armed forces deliberately targeted energy infrastructure facilities. And if at first it was targeted attacks on the distribution systems, in 2024 it became the strategic attacks on power plants. And if before Ukraine could generate up to 32 gigawatts of power, today it struggles to produce 9. These are the these are the facilities that have been targeted, and 2.5 million households are continually affected. While Ukraine being on the front of the struggle for its own existential of its own existence and fighting for democracy and for the European values. At the same time, Ukraine showed unprecedented resilience with the unprecedented help as well of the international allies and support of the European countries. Ukraine has always been privileged in this case, but Ukrainian people also played its huge role, showing unprecedented resilience. And amid ongoing attacks, Ukrainians managed to restore and provide its citizens with the stable electricity and heat. But all of these is directly linked to what I would like you to take out of that. And these are the lessons that we learned in Ukraine. And these are the lessons that the civilized world should take as fast as possible. First, that centralized fossil-based infrastructure is vulnerable, traditional energy systems are insecure, and that renewable-based energy systems can ensure energy security and accelerate net zero transition efforts. To give you an example, to deploy the solar power plant, it can take up to a week. To replace the destroyed solar power panel, it can take up to 3 hours. Totally different from the fossil-based power plant, where it can take from 5 to 7 years to construct and to renovate, up to 3 years. So the lesson that we learned in Ukraine, the lesson that we learned from the conflict-affected countries is that energy transition is not a luxury, and that in Ukraine we don't have the luxury of time, but neither the world does. And these are the optimistic examples of how energy transition is being carried out in Ukraine amid the ongoing war. Despite the active war phase, Ukraine managed to commission up to 2 gigawatts of new renewable energy capacity. And this has been mostly driven by the household, solar, commercial, and some utility-scale solar installations, alongside with new wind, biomass, and small hydro projects. Ukraine has managed to install more onshore wind power since the start of the war than the UK did. And these are the examples. Do I have some time?
Evgenia, if we could wrap in the next minute or so, that would be amazing.
Yes,
Thank you so much.
Of course, sure. So these are the examples with the following pics, how the energy transition was carried out in Ukraine with the solar panels installed on hospitals, schools. This is the school, the hospital. These are the solar panel that was deployed in the garden, in the backyard of the usual buildings. This is the apartment block in Kyiv that installed solar panels for powering elevators and pumps during the blackouts. This is as well the example of that Svetlana Krakovska, the top climate scientist, that installed the solar panel on the apartment building in Kyiv. This is the example of the hospitals as well equipped with the solar panels to proceed with the operation, with the operational units going on amid the blackouts. And energy transition, as shown in Ukraine, has become the pillar of its resilience and the role model for the European Union, UK, and the world. And Ukraine can teach the developed a lot the developed countries a lot, as well as other conflict-affected countries can do. And to wrap it all up, so the lesson that we learned that resilience and energy security are super linked, that we need urgently to phase out fossil fuel dependence, and that is always bottom-up approach to energy security where people matter the most, and that energy security, climate action, and community resilience are deeply interconnected, and that green agenda is not the luxury, but the existential necessity. Thank you very much, and I would have much more to say. Would be happy to share with you the slides and bringing up this existential question whether net zero can be inclusive, whether it can be just, and whether it can be peace. But we in Ukraine say yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much again. Yeah, it's so wonderful to hear more about your work. And thank you so much as well for closing on the examples of Ukrainian resilience with all of those images of solar panels. It really was very heartening to see. Just a reminder that in the cohort booklet, you can find suggested readings for the writing of each of our speakers. So if you want to learn more about Danasri's work or Evgenia's work, Hassan or Nisreen, we've included some materials for you to be able to look at there. Just two small technical notes from me. If you are watching with captions on, can you ensure that you leave those in English at the moment, just because when you change it for yourself, it actually changes it for the whole group. And finally, we will have breakout rooms after the session closes for 15 minutes. So it will allow us a bit of time to discuss what we learned today and meet some of your fellow participants. Please make sure that you change your name to include the language of the room that you would like to join. Now over to you, Luigi.
Okay, so now we have our third speaker, Ghassan Hamad, and I'm really, really excited to introduce him because he's inspired me before on a personal level with like everything I'm about to tell you now. So Ghassan is a data analyst, climate entrepreneur, and community advocate, working at the intersection of environmental justice, innovation, and human rights. He's also the co-founder of a sustainability startup transforming agricultural waste, especially olive mill byproducts, into biodegradable materials and biochar. His work focuses on uplifting the voices and resilience of marginalized communities. Over to you, Ghassan.
Thank you very much, Luigi, and I'm really excited actually to be here with you all because last year I was in your position. I was part of this cohort as well, and honestly, it meant a lot to me. It opened my eyes in so many ways, and my advice to you is you come with this training with an open heart and ask as many questions as possible and build the meaningful friendships that will help you in your climate advocacy after the training. So with that being said, I want to talk today about something from my personal experience. I appreciate the previous speakers for laying the foundation of geopolitics and climate change. And I want to start speaking about people because as climate activists, we know that the problems we're dealing with and the problems we're fighting are deeply connected to power. Power and politics and geography in general. So the way we analyze this actually changes the way our advocacy manifests itself on the ground. And as someone who comes from Palestine, I have struggled a lot. I have lost family members and friends in this brutal, brutal war. And I've seen so many passionate people who are willing and compassionate with my people and want to help. But in a lot of times, advocacy for Palestine and for Ukraine kind of overlooks people. If we look at the first slide, for example, what we see here, we might call them climate refugees. The picture on the right is a woman in a refugee camp in Gaza. who's trying to feed her baby, to look for food resources around. But what I actually see, and I encourage everyone to see in this slide, is um, these are experts in geopolitics, the people that you see in these pictures. I have lost a lot. I have lost business and career and a lot of resources and family member. But I'm telling you that the woman on the right is more of an expert on geopolitics than me. She knows more. She experienced it. Next slide, please. All right. So the way we think of geopolitics, usually we think of states as people, and we think of people as numbers. So when we think of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, or the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, we think of these big figures of governments, kind of on a chessboard, fighting with each other, soldiers moving in from one state, occupying another state, territories expanding. But in a lot of these conversations, the people get lost. We forget about people. We can hear something like 100 Palestinians in Gaza were killed in an airstrike. It becomes a headline, and we forget about it in the next day. What we remember the next day is land and territory. So in Palestine, when a family home is destroyed, it doesn't only means losing a building or losing territory. It means losing safety, losing your childhood memories, you losing your ability to live a normal life. And this is something that I want us to look at when we think of our advocacy. Next slide, please. So what is geopolitics? And I will speak later about why we should ask the question of what is it, and who counts and what counts as geopolitics. So geopolitics is how things like borders and land and natural resources is used by powerful actors to push their interest. It's how power functions through space. And shapes political decision across local, national, regional, and global scales. So the main questions that usually are asked in geopolitics is which state gets what resource, and where is that resource, and why that state conquested that resource or occupied that land. And what I'm trying to do is we shift our perspective and the question asked to who actually profit from that geopolitical event, who is protected, who are the people suffering, and who we are listening to the stories from. Are we listening to diplomats? Where do we get our geopolitical information from? So the textbook, for example, would say, like, who controls the water, for example? Is it Egypt or Ethiopia? But we don't ask much who profits from that geopolitical decision. And this shift actually opens up a much clearer view, a much comprehensive view. Take, for example, any project that claims that takes a piece of land and they plant a lot of trees for carbon sequestration. We need to understand, first of all, are we taking that piece of land from indigenous people? Who is that decision affecting? If we're speaking about electric cars and we want to extract the materials for batteries, who are the people mining for that resource, and how does that changes their life? So if we are agreeing on the point that the people who are most affected and most vulnerable to geopolitical decisions and to climate change are the vulnerable people, and we want to be advocate for the justice for them, so we need to shift our perspective. Next slide, please. So what counts as geopolitics, and why it's important to ask that question? Well, first of all, it changes what we see. Do we see armies and leaders? Do we see these, like male figures fighting over properties? Do we see individual interest? If we pay attention to people and how geopolitics is lived through their bodies and daily life and daily experiences. For example, the woman in the first slide. When we think of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict on the war on Gaza, do we think of that mother ability to feed her kids? When we think about the military occupation in the West Bank, do we think about how surveillance, how being watched all the time shapes the reality of a teenager, of a Palestinian teenager that goes through that on a daily basis? So if we actually pay attention to these things, we start seeing the whole picture. Next slide, please. Okay, one of the most important thing is who gets to speak actually. Is it only diplomats and military experts, or do we listen to ordinary people? Well, like luckily I am from marginalized community, and I went to university and I studied English, but there are a lot of people in my village who don't speak English at all. And I don't think any of the advocates or people who are passionate about supporting Palestinians and people in my country are able actually to even have that conversation with them. And again, they might know more about geopolitics than me. Um, So when we start asking what does a checkpoint feel like from inside the body, what does security mean when you're underdocumented? How do people build futures under the occupation? Um, these questions gets us to ask the question: who do we listen to? For example, a policymaker might talk about border control, but which happens in Palestine a lot. A lot of women give birth on the checkpoints because they are prevented from reaching hospitals because of political events and because of military occupation. So she knows more about geopolitics of the region, about how it feels in the body when the ambulance she's in is being stopped and checked on the checkpoint. Well, she didn't need a degree to understand that. It's just the lived experience of military occupation. Even kids, by the way, kids in my village who are experiencing different layers of violence, they are also expert, and we should pay attention and listen to them. Next slide, please. Okay, asking what counts as geopolitics also changes what solutions look like. So if we look at geopolitics from a traditional lens, we ask the question, how do we negotiate a political settlements? Who gets to have that side of the border of the land? But counting people as main player in geopolitics, we start asking the question, how do we protect their life, and how do we ensure they have enough access to food and sanitary and water and good air quality to live in. Next slide, please. So from that perspective, I want to introduce a lens in which we can use to look at geopolitics when we hear the news. When we want to advocate for the marginalized, for the most vulnerable. The direction that I personally choose to, and the lens that I choose to look through is something called feminist geopolitics, which is a school within the critical geopolitics. It's an approach that redefines what counts as geopolitics. So we become critical of power. The geopolitics on a state level and the decision made by politicians, who does it affects most? So we see who it affects most, and we actually empower them to become main player in geopolitics. So we shift the focus from war rooms to living rooms. We see climate change, we see stresses, we see food deficiencies, we see trauma as major geopolitical events, and we make the invisible struggle of daily life visible again. And we ask the question, which is the most important one: how does geopolitical decisions shape daily survival of Palestinians in Gaza, of marginalized communities in Bangladesh, of people who are living in the borders between Ukraine and Russia? Next slide, please. All right. So the way we analyze geopolitics from a feminist geopolitics lens is that, first of all, we look at the scale. So when we speak about the scale, to understand power, we need to take a finer scale and a coarser scale. And the finer scale means that we look at things closely, at small everyday details, which is how right now in the displacement and transfer and war on Palestinians, how does a kitchen look like? How do people organize to cook? Some people in Gaza, for example, they have managed new ways to cook sand, to make food out of sand. So these are the details we should be paying attention to be able to know how to advocate for them. And the coarser scale, which is stepping back to look at the big picture, why people in Gaza are living in tents right now, and why there is food deficiencies there. Next slide, please. The next thing we should do is to challenge the public-private divide. So in a lot of geopolitical talks, there are things that are considered private that traditional geopolitics doesn't include, which is our private life. And it's usually being put outside these conversations. And we are discussing the public things, which is resource management, who gets that resource. And what feminist geopolitics does is it challenges that. So, for example, private life of a family in Gaza and how they get water, and are the kids having good mental and physical health, is something that should be private, but it's not. It's public. Also, public geopolitical events that should be public, like borders and armies and military occupation and conquests, it should be public things, but it's not. It affects people's private lives. So when we want to understand what we talk about, we need to challenge that divide between public and private, because everything is political. Next slide. And the last thing, which is we need to understand what security means. Security for whom, from what, and at what cost. Let's say we will see it in the next slide. Let's go to the next slide, please. Next one. No, the next one. All right, when we're speaking about security, I see there's problems with the slides. 1 second. So when we're speaking about security, we need to shift the focus from national border security to a more comprehensive way of looking at security. And what that means is that the focus of national security is protecting the state. Did Ukraine gain more land? Did Palestine lose more land? But when we speak about actual security of the people, we should include environmental, economic, social, and health aspect, because this is security for people. This is how they feel security. The actors of national securities are states and diplomats. And when we speak about comprehensive security, it's states and individuals and communities and youth movements like this movement and NGOs. The tools used to manifest national security would be military power and alliances and borders and intelligence agencies, while with a comprehensive security, we're speaking about development aid, human rights, accelerators, youth movements. And the threats when we speak about national security is invasion, weapons of mass destruction, borders and conflict. But when we speak about comprehensive security, we should take into consideration climate change and pandemics, food insecurity, migration, and gender-based violence. And to summarize all of this, again, I want all of us to look at whenever we open the news, whenever we go to protest, whenever we advocate for some people. I suggest we do three things. The first thing is we recognize that there is a slow violence that manifests itself through a climate vulnerability. And climate vulnerability and social problems and gender issues, that we should think about it and not wait for big wars to happen for us to advocate for these people. Second thing is we recenter who are the main players here, and shift the focus from politicians and diplomats to lived experiences of people. And the last thing is we take our representation and advocacy of these communities to redistribution. We should not only include these people on the conversation and talks about climate action and geopolitics, but we should make sure that they are leading these conversations, because they are the ones who know the best. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ghassan. That was incredible. And thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you for sharing your heart with us. Just really thank you, because I think you said everything that everyone else needed to hear, that the people experiencing it are the experts. I think that that's really important to reiterate. So thank you so much. And that was really incredible. Over to you, Alexis.
Thank you so much, Hassan. Really appreciate it. So introducing our last speaker, Nisreen Asaim. Nisreen is a Sudanese young leader and the chairperson of the Sudan Youth Organization on Climate Change, which is a youth-led organization addressing climate issues. As a climate activist and negotiator, she advocates for peace, social democracy, justice, and human rights. In pursuing this goal, she is active in the media. For example, she shared her experiences of escaping conflict, famine, and being cut off from water and electricity in Sudan, and called for peace at the UN at the 79th session of the General Assembly. She has a Master of Science in Renewable Energy from the University of Khartoum, and is currently pursuing and advocating for peace, social democracy, justice, and human rights. Nisreen, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, everyone. I'm very glad to be here with you today. I'm sorry, I'm stuck in my car because my tire just broke and I'm waiting for help for like half an hour now. But thank you for the previous speakers. I really learned a lot from everyone who were trying to tell us how conflict and how climate change and environment intersect with the conflict situation in their countries. Sudan is not very much different from all what previous speakers and colleagues shared. I think maybe the only big difference is that because of the intention and the very great media focus on the conflict in Ukraine and maybe also in Palestine, there was actually resources and will to at least scan and study the environmental impact of the different wars in these two countries. But unfortunately in Sudan, because the media coverage is very low, because Sudan have a long history of wars as well. I think the will to really have investigations and dedicated studies to really see the actual impact of the war on the country is really low. But what I really want to share with you is what happened to us last rainy season, last July 2024. So basically, because as shared at the beginning, Sudan is experiencing 2 years war at the moment, and we are starting the third year. There was many implications of this war, of course, but one of the implications is we have a huge breakout of cholera, unfortunately. And as a result also of the conflict, we have more than 9 million IDPs and refugees in Sudan. And last rainy season, we experienced also a massive flood. And unfortunately, the flood really hit the states where most of the IDPs were concentrated. So more than 2 million people lost their home from the flood. So the 9 million we had became 11 million because the other 2 million lost their homes, not because of the conflict, but because of the climate change and because of the flood. And unfortunately, 5 out of 7 cholera isolation centers were also flooded. You can imagine the disaster. All of the medical waste was flooded. All of the housing and rooms of the patients were flooded, and we are actually experiencing the biggest breakout of cholera at the moment because of that flood. The size of area flooded by water last year was bigger than Germany in size. Sudan is a big country, so when we talk about sizes, normally it's big sizes. So a space bigger than Germany was flooded. I'm saying this is because most of the refugees camp were also flooded, and 2/3 of the total number of refugees and IDPs had to actually move to a second place. So, and they again lost everything they had. So imagine you lose everything you have because of the war, and then you flee to somewhere else, and then a few months later, after you flee to somewhere else, and you start building a new life somehow and trying to cope with everything happening, again you have to leave and lose everything that even you managed to get out of your house with. Because of the flood. And all of the aid mechanisms that we received during the war were not really climate sensitive. And the design of the camps for the IDPs was also not climate sensitive. A lot of camps were actually built on a flood run. And also the focus of the aid was a bit different than what was needed at that time. So purifying bills, water normal saline for the impacts of the cholera, of course having mosquito nets because there was a lot of water, and by that of course there's a lot of burning of mosquitoes, and etc. etc. One other impact that is happening very much in Sudan right now is, and I think my previous colleagues also, especially from Ukraine, touched base on, is the high dependence on biomass for fuel. So Sudan actually, since the war started, lost more than a quarter of their 25% of the green cover and woods due to deforestation, and they cut the trees and carbonize it to make charcoal. So this is actually a triple impact. One, trees carbon sinks, so now we have less trees, so less carbon is being sinked. Two, they burn the trees to get charcoal, and then they burn again the charcoal to get energy for food, for heating water, for boiling water also, because there was not enough purifying bills, and also for lighting sometimes. And this huge impact led into also a massive deforestation, but also a massive desertification. Yes, desertification processes. So now more than 11 kilometers south is now very much a desert, because also the retreat of the green cover allowed more desertified areas to actually prominent. my call for today's session and the main outcomes that we come out with, one, that data is the most important thing, and not having enough data means that we cannot really design proper interventions. And two, climate sensitive aid, especially for countries that are experiencing conflicts, is very important, because climate change is going to hit. It will not say, oh guys, these people already have hard time, I will give them a break this year and come next year. It will not happen like that. It will still keep hitting. So not putting climate change at top of the priorities of countries just because they think they have bigger fish to fry. I hate to bring it to you, but the biggest fish we have here is climate change. And also, since the session today is about geopolitics, also climate change doesn't know borders. So even if you have problems with your neighbors and you have floods, then the flood can actually go for both countries. So bilateral and regional cooperation is a must, especially in the issue of climate change. I think the third one is that there's always going to be a need for innovation, and the innovation is there. It just needs a lot of support and a lot of finance, and of course a stage where people can communicate their ideas. Earlier, I said that there is not enough coverage for what happens in Sudan, because other areas are being more covered. And it's not. It shouldn't be like this. Now, we, as countries in conflict and countries that are extremely vulnerable to climate change, we are actually in a competition who is going to be mentioned in the news more, not for finding a new cure or medicine, but for how many victims we have, how many aid we received, how many bombs have been thrown. And I think humanity should really overcome this stage and go into more of a development stage, rather than always rebuilding what was there and then destroyed. I am building currently a coalition for young climate activists who are coming from countries in conflict. We call it YALAP, which is a shortcut for Youth Alliance for Local Adaptation and Peace. We are focusing on 27 countries. These 27 countries are the 27 countries mentioned with the highest vulnerability, but at the same time, they scored highest also on the fragility index, and the highest lower in terms of the peace index. So they are either experiencing conflict at the moment or experienced conflict before, all the way from Myanmar, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh, passing by the Middle East and Africa, and going all the way to Venezuela and Colombia. And I can tell you, everyone are saying the same thing. There are three main categories that young people are focusing on in these countries. One, access to international stages and conferences, because they are always denied visas and so on, and access to media, because it's very important to hear their side of the story and to hear how they are thinking to solve these issues. And secondly, access to technology, because technology is really important, but because they are under sanction, or because whatever problem is happening with their government, they are denied this access to climate tech, and it's also a very big problem. And last and third is access to finance. And I think we all share the same idea that young people are not getting enough climate finance, but countries in conflict are even worse. Actually, the percentage is 1 to 17. So if a developing country gets $17, a developing country, but in conflict, get only $1. And this is also a very awful percentage, and I think we should do more on that. So please feel free also again to contact me if you think your organization fits the criteria or fall within these 27 countries, or if you think that you can do something with the network, and because countries in conflict matter and they are always marginalized. They don't have strong governments to represent them. Even if they have strong governments, they don't really care. And this is my son jumping to the call. Neil, stop. Over here. Yeah, it's working. Well,
Amazing.
a cherry on top. We have a cherry on top. Yeah, so please, guys, speak about countries in conflict, all of them, and also speak about how can you help them, because sometimes just mentioning the country and letting the world know what is happening is enough, but also push to keep climate change on top of the agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nasreen. Lovely to see your son, and thank you for your really incredible remarks, and also for providing us with an outlet for those who are joining on the call who fit into that category for them to join you in your important work. So thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to hear from you. Evgenia, I just wanted to check if you can stay a little bit longer as we have so many questions. We thought we'd try to get through at least one each for each of you. So I will hand over to Luigi to ask the first question to Danasri.
Okay, so the very first question is, how do we balance the environmental and geopolitical issues with deep sea mining with the need for minerals for clean energy? And could you talk a bit about what the current geopolitical conversation is discussing regarding the pros and cons of this?
Thanks for that question. And it's $1 million question, to be honest, because there's so much conversation going on about, the potential of deep sea mining and the minerals that lie in the seabed. And like to start with, first of all, commercially, deep sea mining hasn't really started. There's a lot of exploratory work happening right now. But the technology itself has evolved to an extent that, the feasibility has sort of increased. So a lot of industries, a lot of countries are showing more interest than they were doing before. But seabed mining is already happening in many places within the exclusive economic zones, within the national waters of countries. And deep sea mining is mostly like in the international waters, which comes under the purview of the International Seabed Authority. So it has more of a legal role to play to decide how does this happen. And thankfully, many countries are taking a very precautionary approach to this, because they understand that what we have very little knowledge of what's there under the sea, in terms of marine biodiversity and the kind of impacts, mining operations, even exploration, what kind of impacts could this have on marine biodiversity, and then its knock-on effects on, governance, on social impacts, fisheries, and many other sectors on which livelihoods are dependent as well. So that's important to consider as well. So because of the lack of knowledge, it's important that this is something that is just going to open a Pandora's box. But it is divided right now. Even some of the island countries in the Pacific, for instance, are in favor of seabed mining, because this is something that provides, opportunity for economic development. Again, development for whom is a different question, but this is something that is being raised by many countries, that this is, could be like a something that could provide economic opportunities, while many other countries have called for a moratorium on this. So within the High Seas Treaty, it was a very divided conversation on this because of the differences that exist on how far we can go. But anyway, like the technology, as I said, is exorbitantly expensive right now. It's not something that everyone could have access to. So again, if you're going by a very structural explanation of this, the big countries with more money, more technological advantages would have a much bigger role to play in deciding the rules of engagement as well, because that's what we also saw in some of the negotiations that have happened so far. So we need to be like sort of very careful about how these conversations would be carried forward without necessarily involving the most vulnerable populations, or without really looking at the scientific reasoning as well. Because the argument that is used here is that the mining on land is going to cause more pollution than mining in the sea. But that is a very strange argument to use when you have very little knowledge of what's there in the sea. And so I think that's something that we need to also look at. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And especially with like all of the new discoveries that have been like just in the past few months, with oxygen being found and stuff like in the rocks. So thank you so much for that answer. Over to you, Alexis.
Thanks so much. Evgenia, we have a question for you. How can decentralized systems truly empower people if they're still owned or controlled by large private actors or foreign investors? Are we decentralizing power or just infrastructure?
Bless you. Thank you very much for the questions. And actually, I have received so many questions, and honestly, I'm super inspired by very witty and like very precise questions on the topic. So I promised that I would follow up on most of the questions, and then I would provide it to Alexis and Luigi because they are so much interesting. And I have been writing and speaking like about many things, including what the previous question like referred to about when we are talking about phasing out what we're going to phase in, and from the recent conversations and high level events where I took part in London Defense Conference and the other high level events and small small discussions behind the closed doors. Everybody is super scared about the dependency on China these days because of them being the monopolist of the critical raw materials, and especially in the developed countries like the UK. Thank you very much from the decentralized, because it's so much multidimensional, and like all of I very much liked one of the comments that we are living in the multi-crisis world, right? Like polycrisis, mega crisis, like there are different scholars terms in that part. But the question about the decentralized, how we can empower communities, actually, we should not empower, they are empowering themselves. Because when we're talking about the crisis, the war, or any other massive threat, people are mobilizing themselves. So like the key issue that is there, that the governments are not able, they are not institutionally wise, and with the rigid structures of the government of the state, they are unable to respond to the crisis fast. And these are always people who are getting mobilized. And this was the example of Ukraine when Ukrainians were deploying the solar panels on their balconies in the block of the apartments, because they knew that only in this way they can ensure their security, their energy supply. So when we're talking about decentralized systems as it is, it's multi-dimensional challenge, because there was very great question about how we can ensure energy transition without nuclear. I'm sorry, but I am afraid that we cannot because of the base load, and we need something to provide this base load, and renewables, they are fantastic solution, but without the base load generation, I think it's impossible. And we should believe in butterflies and like pink ponies, but we can't. But we shouldn't demonize nuclear as well. And this is again the experience of Ukraine, because Ukraine, before the full Russian scale invasion, had 55% of its energy mix produced by nuclear. And now it is decreased because of occupation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, but still it is there and it is providing with the base load. Of course, again, it's not one solution fits all, but when we're talking about this microgrids, decentralized, people-centered microgrid systems where we have the renewable-based production, where we have battery storages, where we have the proper small-scale systems operating, so-called microgrids. This is the solution to many countries. And I was talking a lot to the experience, to experts who were representing, for example, in Palestine, or that this, when we have the absence of the centralized power, then it is much easier to deploy small-scale gas turbines or solar panels. It's very quickly, they're unfoldable, they are being brought, and they are like very quickly responding to the needs of the community. But if we think broader and we replace gas turbines with the solar panels, for example, it is enough, especially when we're talking about those regions that are currently affected. Usually they have super high solar capacity. So we shouldn't enable people. People are enabling themselves. So to wrap it up, we should support them, and we should possibly guide the international aid agencies that these are the priorities, but at the same time, we are showing conflict-affected country, they are showing the developed world, the world that hasn't been experiencing war yet and hopefully will not, that this is the way how they should rearrange their energy systems as well. Because climate emergency is not only about the war, because climate emergency and climate crisis is gonna hit every single country in the world. And this means that unless we ensure now the resilience of our systems, the crisis would hit even those countries, including the UK. We all experience heat waves and extreme weather events.
Thank you so much, Evgenia. So many insights packed into one answer. Luigi, over to you.
Okay, so the next question is for Rasen. People in the global south often bear the brunt of the intersection of climate change and geopolitics. So what's the best way to convince people that platforms such as the UNFCCC still serve their needs when their struggles such as decolonization are being pushed to the side?
That's a very interesting question. Well, since the war on the last war on Gaza, bringing the Palestinian topic to these international platforms have been like very controversial. And I might not know the answer to that question, but my goal with my presentation today is that we as climate activists, I think our most pressing job right now is to actually go to the people who are suffering from the consequences of these war by the decision that are made at the conference of the party or the UN, and ask them what they want. So, for example, I could give an example on that. Is that we all heard like President Donald Trump speaking about transferring Palestinians from Gaza to neighboring countries, so it's safer for them. And on the other side, there was, advocates and other countries and other allies of the Palestinian people who said, no, we will not allow that to happen, for example. But if we think about it if we actually go to the lives and again, think of that finer scale of how that decision is made, and we think about, some people in Gaza might not want to leave their grandparents' home, might not feel good about actually leaving the only place that they have left. But other families would actually choose to leave to other countries because they're afraid for the safety of their children. So who do we advocate for, transferring Palestinians or against that? Should we give them the option or prevent them from having the option? And what I'm trying to say is that in any national conflict, in any geopolitical events, we should get back to the people and ask them what is their most pressing need. So, for example, I could get another example is that the ship, I think the name of the ship was Madeline, which is an amazing act of compassion and standing with the Palestinian people. But actually, the aid on that ship didn't get to the Palestinian people. And maybe those resources were better allocated or like invested in the Palestinian people in a different way. So we need to pay attention. Is our advocacy actually helping the Palestinian people or not? Is keeping or bringing the intersectionality to places where it will be, oppressed or like put aside or ignored? Is this something that helps the Palestinian people on the ground? I personally think that these are questions that we should think about after. How do we bring the people who are most affected and most vulnerable to climate change and to military occupation to these platforms so they can speak for themselves, so that we're not just presenting them, but we're centering them in these talks. But for now, the most pressing need is, how do we get them water? How do we end the siege? How do we get the humanitarian aid to the Palestinian people in Gaza?
Thank you so much, Hassan. Really, really powerful words. How do we get them their basic needs? And I'm upset that we even have to ask this question, because it should be something that goes without saying. Over to you, Alexis.
Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for being patient as we went over time today. It's just that we have such incredible speakers, as we do every week, and wanted to have a bit of time for the Q&A, but we have a interactive session tomorrow where we'll have more time for interaction between you. So just as our last question to Nasreen, do you have any advice on how to focus our efforts for advocacy while making sure we make space for the experts of the conflicts themselves? And I don't know, Nasreen, if you're able to answer, if you're still with the car.
Yeah, I am here. Yeah, so basically, the balance is very easy. Climate change is not a standalone problem. It has a very much grounded roots in all of the other problems that we are facing nowadays. Yeah. The question is actually how to localize the research so we can also localize the solutions. Currently, we are talking about climate change, peace, and security. And last year, I did a small study on how many researches that we already have on climate change, peace, and security contexts. And I found not many. I mean, it's around 1,600 research, but guess what? Only 70, which is almost 10% of the researches about climate change, peace, and security in countries in conflict were actually written by scholars from these countries itself. So I think there is a lot of ideas on decolonizing aid, decolonizing research, decolonizing knowledge, and so on. But I really think that we also should decolonize the perception of what our local problems are. And then people really mix the idea of climate change, because they say, yes, but it's not our problem because it's the West or the North or the developed countries who actually emitted. They need to find a solution for that. And I say, yes, they have to find a solution for energy transition and for lowering the emission and so on. But the actual impact, the actual adaptation processes that should happen is not their problem, it's our problem. And we really need to communicate our problem and also find solution for that. And according to the historical responsibility, according to the Convention of Climate Change itself, the polluters must pay. And I think being clear about it, on whose role to do what and when, is really the way to do it. Thank you very much. I really think this is a very rich session, and the questions were also very rich from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadine. I'm going to give some closing remarks. Thank you so much to the interpreters. Thank you so much to our speakers. For the interpreters, I know we've gone over time. If you guys would like to leave, that's totally fine. I'm gonna take about a minute or so. But basically, I know that today has been a heavy session, and we've got to know a lot of things that we didn't know before, and you're probably feeling that the road is very heavy right now. And climate disasters, political tensions, uncertain futures, it's really, really easy to feel overwhelmed. But I want to remind you guys that in times like these, youth have come together before. History has shown us that young people rise up during these moments, and it's their voices that refuse to stay silent. And now it's our turn to do that, to mobilize in the ways that we can. And yeah, basically that's all. I just think that we shouldn't despair. We have the power to an extent, at least to keep our own humanity. And we can do that by mobilizing ourselves in the ways that we can, whether that's through art, whether that's through cooking, whether that's through protests, whatever you can do in your country that will keep you safe, then please do it, but just don't stay silent. And thank you so much.